In 2016, and then again 4 years later, something unprecedented almost happened in American politics. Bernie Sanders, an outsider hailing from the left, came close to winning the Democratic nomination for president. Of course, there had been prior instances of progressive candidates trying to bring the left into the fold. Yet this was different. Sanders did not just seek to broaden the Democratic base. As an independent senator, his goal was to conquer the Democratic Party machine. While the Bernie campaign was unique, attempted takeovers have been a common and consequential feature of right-wing politics in the U.S. This is the argument persuasively developed by Joe Lowndes, a scholar of American right-wing politics and an intrepid ethnographer of its most extremist exponents. In the last 6 decades, Joe Lowndes explains, whenever segments of the radical right have set out to capture the Republican Party in order to remake it in their own image, they have either succeeded outright or planted the seeds for later triumphs. Lowndes' first book made a compelling case for the reassessment of the so-called Southern strategy that brought Richard Nixon to power in 1968 and got him re-elected in 1972. Entitled From the New Deal to the New Right, the book showed that the silent majority successfully mobilized by Nixon's campaign managers should not be interpreted as the absorption of segregationist Dixiecrats into a pre-existing GOP. Instead, the Southern strategy consisted of a conquest and subsequently a transformation of the Republican Party by Southern Democrats. What Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign had started, despite his crushing defeat in the presidential election, turned out to be the prelude to an enduring makeover of the American right. The Republican Party had always left the door at least ajar for nativists and racialist ideologues, but Joe Lowndes stresses that until the end of the Cold War, both the imprint of the civil rights movement and the strictures of the U.S.-led international liberal order kept the GOP leadership in check, at least rhetorically. Even under Ronald Reagan, socially regressive measures largely needed to be couched in color and gender-blind discourse. Such self-imposed restraint began to loosen after the fall of the Berlin Wall, however, at least on the margins of the party and as a reaction against the neoconservative sway over the Republican establishment. From his book, Parasites, Patriots, co-written with Daniel Martinez HoSang, to his forthcoming book, Adventures in Postdemocracy, Joe Lowndes' recent work examines the gradual permeation of the conservative mainstream by far-right currents. He retraces a course of events that begins with Pat Buchanan's failed bid for the Republican nomination in 1992 and that runs through Donald Trump's first and second coming. In our interview, he revisits the forays successively made by the paleo-conservatives in the 1990s and the Tea Party under the presidency of Barack Obama, before delving into the evolving relationship between neo-fascist groups, the MAGA base, and the Trump administration. Among the striking insights that Joe Lowndes draws from his exploration of the bleakest corners of American politics is that what the media depicted as the low points of Trump 1.0 proved instrumental in the real estate magnate's return to power. Far from fraying in the face of apparent setbacks, the MAGA coalition grew more radical but also more determined and self-confident in the wake of the alt-right debacle in Charlottesville, the COVID pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the aborted coup of January 6, 2021. Another major development that Joe Lowndes has explored in his collaborative work with Daniel Martinez HoSang, and again in our interview with him, is the emergence of a multiracial far-right in the United States. Already examined in Parasites, Patriots, this remarkable, if paradoxical trend has been confirmed by the increase in minority votes for Trump from 2016 to 2024, but also by the growing presence of activists of color in the most extreme far-right groups. This hardly means that racism and xenophobia are less prominent with Trump 2.0, quite the contrary. What is new, however, is the fact that the MAGA cult is increasingly welcoming to anyone eager to celebrate whiteness, nativism, and masculinity, regardless of their race, nationality, or gender. Finally, we asked Joe Lowndes what his peregrinations at Trump rallies and other major gatherings of the New Right have taught him, not only about MAGA's social and affective fabric, but also about the blind spots and avoidance techniques of its adversaries. Rather than confront their responsibilities in the current situation, liberals merely long for a return to the status quo ante. Leftists, meanwhile, are often more inclined to focus on the failures of liberalism than to address what we are up against now. Our interview took place in New York on February 24th, 2025.
So, let's start with what has often been perceived as a prequel to the Trumpist moment, which is the emergence of the paleoconservative movement or sensibility in the late 80s and turn of the 90s. So the question I would like to ask is about that moment itself. Also, at some point, if you could insert in it its sort of renegade left element, based on the review Telos that started on the left and that moved to the far right and that informed this paleoconservative, just like Trotskyites elements informed the neoconservative. Second, the enmity between the paleoconservative and the neoconservative and how the paleoconservative constructed themselves against the neoconservative, and how this sentiment, this enduring sentiment of anti-neoconservative sentiment, or specifically paleoconservative sentiment, re-emerges with Trump 1.0 and then with Trump 2.0, with an element which maybe you could start with is, because you said at some point that the failure of the paleoconservatives when they emerged, their failure to win, has proved instrumental in their second coming through Trumpism.
Okay, great. I think, one of the things I think is generally the case is that we ought to always, we should be kind of chronicling politics and observing them in their failures as much as in their successes, because it's always the case that any successful political movement you see of any kind rests on prior failures. Political actors try things, they don't work, they partially work, they recombine different elements, they try again, different kind of discursive interventions or different kinds of coalitions they try to build. And I think that that's, there's so many things today, I think, that we can look back on it and see where failures began to set the terms for later successes. I think that, the thing about the Buchanan campaign, I think to go to that moment, it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was no longer a kind of a cohesive glue holding the American two-party system together in the same way. The same kind of like liberal democratic belief in a kind of an anti-totalitarianism. It starts with anti-Nazism just after the war, and then anti-Soviet totalitarianism also in that period, is what really kind of held, put boundaries on both the left and the right in American politics across the long post-war era until you get to the 1990s. Aziz Rana makes the legal theorist Aziz Rana, who's at Cornell University, makes this point really well, that that with the end of the Cold War, suddenly the horizons are open for new kinds of politics. And one of the things you see with Buchanan, he ran. So Pat Buchanan was he had been a newspaper reporter in St. Louis as a young man before he was recruited to Richard Nixon's 68 campaign as a speechwriter. He was also a speechwriter for Spiro Agnew, he was Nixon's first vice president and always had a much more pugnacious, kind of like often openly racist, combative way of speaking. Nixon could hold off and not, as a presidential candidate in that time period, could not be as openly bare-teethed as a vice presidential candidate could. Spiro Agnew was that person, and it was Pat Buchanan who wrote all his speeches. Buchanan was the son of conservative Catholics. His father was an enormous admirer of Franco. And some of this kind of like deeply hierarchical conservative Catholic conservatism comes through in Buchanan's own work. You know, at that time, Catholics in the United States generally were, a constituent part of the Democratic coalition and generally progressive on a number of issues. So he kind of is a little bit of an outlier there. But he, across the 70s, continues to indulge his kind of more, kind of populist right-wing visions of either a new party formation. He's part of a group of kind of renegade Republicans who tried to run a third-party effort in the mid-1970s, running George Wallace, they hoped, as a third-party candidate in '76. They hoped to actually have a Reagan Wallace ticket, which didn't come to pass. But Buchanan was always pushing the boundaries of against kind of an old school conservative republicanism. He wanted kind of a more bare-knuckled populist right-wing politics. He was a syndicated columnist in the 70s. Then he became Reagan's communications director, and again was on Reagan's very right flank, and was embattled with neocons in the Reagan administration, and felt betrayed. Felt the conservative revolution had been betrayed by these neocons, and so he by the end of Reagan's second term, he leaves feeling very disappointed in the possibilities of the party. And he considers running in 1988 as a third-party candidate, or first maybe as a Republican candidate for president, and then maybe as a third-party candidate. He decides not to do that. And then, over the next 4 years, a number of things begin to happen in American politics that open up the possibility. George H.W. Bush won the presidency in '88 in part by running a super racist campaign, using the famous Willie Horton ad, for instance. And then there was kind of a renaissance of a kind of more open racism in the post-civil rights era in the U.S. generally. So by 1990, Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon David Duke had run for the state legislature and won a seat in the state legislature in Louisiana, and then he ran for governor after that, and almost won in 1991 as a Republican candidate, for governor in Louisiana. Buchanan thinks this is. What he says, think about the way we should deal with Duke is to find all the issues that are the same ones that conservatives have, Republicans have, and build on those. He said, we don't need to reject Duke. Find out where there's possible overlap and use that overlap to build a robust politics out of. And then he decides to run himself in '92. He has kind of a small group of advisors around him. One of them was Sam Francis. Francis was kind of a Gramscian organic intellectual of the right. He was an historian trained at University of North Carolina, who had had a job at the Heritage Foundation, and then was editor of the Washington Times, a conservative newspaper, and was an award-winning editor and a really terrific writer and a sharp analyst of politics. He was fired from the Washington Times for he was also a white supremacist and just couldn't hold back his racist vitriol often. So Francis was, he was in his own description, a Caesarist. He thought what American politics needed was a very powerful executive, a very powerful presidential model that could be a battering ram against the administrative state, that could coalesce the energies of kind of an angry middle America, people who were alienated by the professional managerial class, people who were alienated by what was going on in Hollywood and in higher education. And he was ultimately an opponent of democracy. He was one of Buchanan's advisors. The other one was a guy named Joe Sobran, who had been an editor at National Review magazine, who was fired for his, similar to Francis, in his case, he was fired for his inability to hold back his anti-Semitism. So these were the people around Buchanan, kind of his kind of brain trust as he ran in '92. And what they hoped to do was build out kind of this alienated white populist coalition that they had dreamed of also, or that Buchanan had in the mid-'70s, dreamed of that as being, there's another story here, which is this is the political tradition that begins with the silent majority that Nixon hopes to build in '68 and '72. Which is a great political story in and of itself. But so Buchanan runs partly in this moment where he sees there's an availability to start talking about things on the right that were not possible during the Cold War era. And he begins to kind of push, celebrating, neo-Nazi leaders in South Africa, for instance, or kind of making kind of openly anti-Semitic, comments about one person or another. He has people around him who are connected to white supremacist organizations. He himself comes very close to making white supremacist and anti-Semitic comments all the time, and he thinks that he can build up he makes appeals to the labor movement. He makes appeals to unions. He wants to bring manufacturing back. He really, he has this kind of old American isolationist America First politics, which really ran entirely counter to the whole Republican establishment at the time. No Republican wanted anything to do with him. He had to build this movement, this coalition, really out of grassroots activists and people on the far right. It was not something that neocons were willing to tolerate. But nevertheless, he does a good enough job to get a primetime speaking spot in the 1992 Republican convention, where he gives his famous culture war speech. And it's an electrifying speech to the assembled delegates. And he was not going to make it to the promised land himself, but he had, made his presence known as a tendency in the right that was not going to go away.
Mm-hmm. And just like Moses, the fact that he didn't get to the promised land explains why you eventually get to the promised land.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. Canaan's finally going to be, populated by these people. And so this is, there's a lot to be said about both Buchanan runs again in 1996 with less support. He does well in New Hampshire, does well in South Carolina, but that's pretty much it for him. He runs again in 2000 as a Reform Party candidate. And his opponent directly to his left is Donald Trump in that election cycle. Trump is calling him a Nazi and a Klansman, and it's kind of an interesting different moment. But in that early '90s moment, I think the writer John Gantz captures a lot of this in his book When the Clock Broke, that came out last year. But there is one thing about the early '90s, I think, is that, and I think this is not really discussed enough, is that there was a renaissance of American racism in that moment. It's kind of like the American Civil Rights Movement, the long Black liberation struggle had kind of run out of gas by then. There were very few the movements have been crushed and destroyed by the FBI and by other forces and by general exhaustion. And it was possible to really begin to more openly embrace kind of racially oriented politics, and it's across the spectrum, right? When Bill Clinton runs in 1992, there's too much to talk about here, but he goes on for. There's racial components to his campaign everywhere. When the bell curve comes out, the Herrnstein and Charles Murray book, 800-page, book about the genetic. Genetic hierarchy that, when that book comes out, it's kind of an old eugenics tome, but the New York Times praises it, is saying, well, finally someone's willing to speak openly about this. The racist kind of journal gathering point, American Renaissance, begins to have, it's a eugenics white supremacist organization that begins to have influence. It brings together people like Sam Francis and some of these other old National Review people like John Darbyshire and other people. And those people all influence Buchanan's campaign. So there's something there. There's this flourishing of white racism in this moment, and it's everywhere to be seen. And it's what gives us the idea of a crack baby, which is a mythical character, or the super predator, another mythical character. Here's Rogan's counter-subversion, the production of these monsters that white liberals embrace all over the place as well. So. Buchanan is kind of this spearhead. This is also after the LA riots in '92. There's so much going on in terms of a racially charged animus there that Buchanan is only the right-wing end of, or a spearhead of. It's everywhere else in American culture. And I think that helps explain a lot of where we end up with. The telos part, just briefly, is that telos was as a curious critical theory, kind of a Marcusean critical theory journal that began it's begun by 68ers, like new left elements who really wanted to. It was kind of an anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist, critical theory-oriented journal, which brought together an extraordinary array of great thinkers from the early and mid-70s. I think from kind of Western Marxists to anarchists to kind of Frankfurt School oriented thinkers. By the time you get to the early 90s, Paul Piccone, the editor of the journal, has decided that based on Herbert Marcuse's one-dimensionality thesis, that there's no possibility in American society, there's no way in capitalist society to generate new forms of resistance, that everything is immediately absorbed and sold back as a form of consumerism, and that there's, it's kind of a version of Adorno's administrative state with capitalism, and there's no way out. And so they begin to look for other possible spaces where you actually have forms of organic society outside of capitalist influence or capitalist control. And they start looking to the French New Right, with Alain de Benoit, for instance, who's talking about a multiculturalism and a form of cultural difference, which is, a racial taxonomy, an ethnic taxonomy of groups who can, who once brought together can only be brought together through corporate capitalists, culture. So partly they look to the French New Right, partly they look to Carl Schmitt, partly they look to the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, partly they look to American populism, and they begin through this kind of Schmittian populist vision, begin to articulate a far-right politics. I was in Paul Piccone's office one time. He used to be down on 12th Street here in the East Village. And he had an American flag on the wall and a Pat Buchanan sticker, also on the wall. And it was like this was Telos, the great, and then he also, on the other hand, there was a manuscript on his desk that I asked him what it was that they were working on. He said it was an unpublished or untranslated manuscript by Gustav Landauer, the great German anarchist, that they were in the process of turning into a series of articles for Telos. And so they, this was the kind of eclectic scene that Telos was, always kind of open in kind of an earnest way to really any direction that might seem appealing as a form of anchoring in anti-capitalism. But ultimately there was this, the far right had a stronger appeal to them than many other directions. And this is partly, Christopher Lasch was very influential at that time on the, the culture of narcissism and The True and Only Heaven were both, nodal points for Telos at the time, for calling for kind of a retreat to the patriarchal family as a way of resisting, of building up the ego and resisting capitalist culture. And there's a lot, there's many layers to this, but there was a Telos conference in 1992 maybe, where I saw Sam Francis speak and argue for populism to the assembled Telos editors and other people in the room, and where he argued that if they were really serious about this, they had to embrace all kinds of populist revolt. And the example he used was the anti-Semitic riots in London in 1947. And he was doing it to be provocative, but nobody in the room had an answer for him, and so it was kind of a strange moment. I think that was partly a moment where Telos was, some people like Richard Wolin and other people on the left were kind of leaving Telos at that time. Others stuck around and continued this role until Piccone died a few years ago.
Perhaps we could move forward in time just a little bit to touch briefly on a couple other critical junctures that you explore in the forthcoming book, Adventures in Postdemocracy. So to begin, perhaps, in the early 2000s, could you just give an account of the relative eclipse of this paleocon hard right that you were just describing? And then after that, how about the far right's fixation on Obama, which included, of course, birtherism, in which Trump took part, and maybe that running up through the rise of the Tea Party?
One of the things about what happens by the end of the 90s is that there are no longer, both the Democratic and Republican parties have succeeded in crushing the most important elements of not just the Black freedom struggle, but of kind of anti-racism and anti-discrimination generally. This was, the kind of prison industrial complex was fully put into place by Clinton. Welfare reform had dismantled the basic elements and guarantees of a welfare system. And so there was no issues of crime and welfare, which were always the big issues for the right, and to generate votes by white voters for both parties, these were victories that had been won, and so there was not the same kind of possibility of sharpening a campaign on the stone of racial animus anymore. So when George Bush runs in 2000, he actually does it with a certain kind of like multiculturalism. He on the campaign trail, he talks about compassionate conservatism. He assembles the most diverse cabinet in American history by far. He continually makes kind of anti-racist appeals. His chief campaign speechwriter and then White House speechwriter makes appeals, kind of racial reconciliation appeals over and over for Bush to read out on the campaign trail. So I think Bush was, for many reasons, kind of represented a certain kind of multiracial conservatism. And I've written a lot about that elsewhere, of Bush and those politics. But it kind of, shifted, particularly after 9/11, the kind of vectors of American political conservatism towards back towards liberal empire building. Like, there was Bush's own administration was staffed by neocons, partly from his father's generation, but also with empire builders who had these new opportunities that came up after 9/11 and made the possibility for war in Iraq and war in Afghanistan, and that becomes kind of a different. In some ways, looking back, it's almost a little bit of an outlier moment in American conservative politics, in terms of what the right is able to do afterwards and against Bush in that time period. But I think if you read Bush's his memoir Decision Points, he says that the lowest point in his presidency was after Hurricane Katrina, when Kanye said George Bush doesn't care about black people. He said for him that was his worst moment, which is an extraordinary thing to, whether he means it or not, it's an extraordinary thing to put in his memoir in a way. So I think that there's probably a lot more to be said about that turn in American conservatism, both in terms of what stops there, but also in terms of what we see pop up again, 15 years later.
Mm-hmm. And with the Tea Party, briefly.
Yeah, so Buchananism comes roaring back in with the Tea Party movement. It was around, once Obama is elected, the relationship of Obama's election and the Great Recession creates the possibility for a new kind of populist right-wing politics that had not existed. There was not the possibility of prior to that. For right-wing populism in the United States always was organized against the idea of elites above, liberal elites above, overly educated, corporate-oriented, foundation-based elites, and the dependent poor below, represented by black and brown people. Obama is both of those things, right? He represents both poles. He's like a Martha's Vineyard elite, and he's also a black son of an African Muslim migrant. So he's kind of the perfect confection for American right-wing populism. And the attempt to pass the Affordable Care Act is the place where that energy is solidly placed. And first there's the emergence of the Tea Party in this complicated moment after when the economic crash happens, where you have Bush and Obama working together before Obama was president to create and implement the Toxic Asset Relief Program, which is something that pisses off people on the right and the left, and helps create the basis for a right-wing populist revolt against what the banks are doing, as well as what liberal elites are doing, and as well as what a Bush who is no longer popular is doing. And so there's a lot going on in that moment, which is, I think, there's a lot to be plumbed in terms of the complicated and explosive racing class politics that were made possible by Obama's election and the recession. But the Tea Party is able to organize quickly. At the time, people on the left and progressives wanted to say, or liberals and progressives wanted to say, that it was a AstroTurf party, that this was all funded by the Koch brothers, and this entire thing was created and funded by them for protest after protest, and that wasn't really true. It was true that their organization, Americans for Prosperity, pumped a lot of money into Tea Party candidacies in 2012, and it was also true that they ran workshops for local organizers all over the country, so they would have them read The Economist Skousen or whatever else, and these kind of weekend things would bring together housewives and contractors and small entrepreneurs and business, and so there was kind of a movement from below that the Koch brothers met with money from above and helped build out a social movement that also had a sharp political orientation, and there's a way that Republicans are quite good, and have been since '64, at inviting in their right-wing social movements into the party, right? They just, the door is open to them for these kinds of revolts from below that you never see with Democrats. and to the peril of the American left, I think. And so then, once the Tea Party candidates began winning elections in that time period, a lot of it had to do with demonizing Obama as a socialist. They didn't, just to call him a socialist was to put together race and class in a way that it was like the word socialist became a racial epithet, right? It was like that socialism meant blackness and blackness meant socialism. And that was what was key about that, which matters now, is what the Tea Party really perfected. It's been a key term for the right since 1964. But what they really perfected was the idea and a strategy for going after public goods directly by doing it in a racial way, by saying that you're going after kind of like racially inflected public programs and entitlements. You're able to hollow out things for everybody else as well. And race then is a way to get in the door to attack redistributive policies generally, or to attack forms of taxation. And so you have Obama there representing socialism to them, and as we know, Obama was
And elitism at the same time.
and elitism at the same time, which was kind of the idea of like what people thought of socialism anyway, that this was something that was not populist or popular, or something that's being imposed from above by a cabal of, and these kinds of monsters are a post-Cold War thing that can be said and articulated and imagined in a way that was not really quite, during the long duration of the American New Deal state and the social democratic guarantees that inhered in that, that kind of language wasn't possible. It really was only after, Reagan softens it up here, just as Thatcher does in England, but it's really not until this kind of like 1990s, after the 1990s, it really this becomes possible. And it's not really till Obama's election when you really have because there's something about presidents here which matters. Presidents are an incredibly emotionally and affectively charged figure in American politics. They combine the ceremonial aspects of a king with the kind of political aspects of a prime minister in a way that creates the possibilities of cultural and social identification of both adoration for some and hatred for others. And so presidents play this very charged role, and we see it over and over again. And for Obama, once you have a black man in that position, it really just opens the floodgates for all kinds of things, which made the Tea Party really, I've got some crazy stories about that, but anecdotes, but which I can tell or not tell, but
Tell one.
okay. So I'll give you one. There was a brilliant political theorist, an anarchist activist and political theorist named Joel Olson, who died a number of years ago, and he and I who had been organizers and activists together in Minneapolis many years ago, and he was a professor at Northern Arizona University in the 2000s. And he asked me to come down and give a talk on race and the Tea Party at Northern Arizona. And this was less than a month after Gabby Giffords had been shot and 3 other people had been killed in a mass shooting in Arizona aimed at Tea Party, in kind of a political context set up by the Tea Party for political violence towards liberals and Democrats. And
Gabby Gifford was...
She was Gabby Giffords was a Democratic member of Congress, a House member, who was a supporter of the Affordable Care Act, and so had been depicted in kind of Tea Party propaganda as a real demon and a traitor to America. Sarah Palin had a campaign where she put the names and faces of a number of people who had been supporters of the Affordable Care Act in Congress up on her website in crosshairs, in gun crosshairs, and Giffords was one of them. So this guy named Jared Lochner who was mentally unstable but also politically oriented, had carried out this mass shooting. Anyway, so I go down to give a talk, and Joel has provocatively made a poster that is a picture of the first Public Enemy album image of a cop in crosshairs, and was with my name, Racing the Tea Party, public talk at Northern Arizona University. And so we're in his office the morning of the talk, and just kind of catching up on old times. And the dean walks into his office and says, so we're getting reports that there are going to be Tea Partiers who may protest outside the talk tonight. Do you want security to keep them off campus? And Joel said, no, there's no reason to keep these people off campus. And she said, well, what if they want to come into the venue for the talk? And before I could say anything, Joel says, that's great, let them come in, bring them in. And she said, well, what if they want to come in with their signs and posters and they want to disrupt the talk? And I'm feeling a little nervous, just because because of things that have just been happening in Arizona, and I'm the perceived target of this whole thing. And Joel says, no, that'll be great. He claps me on the shoulder and says, think how many talks we disrupted in our time, Joe. This will be awesome. So he's really excited about the possibility there's going to be, he was a deep defender of democratic contestation, of the most extreme. He was a great theorist of zealotry and the importance of zealotry and the importance of democracy being, involving like angry polarization as his own vision of freedom. So anyway, so that night I give the talk, and there's 25 Tea Partiers come in. They're in the room. They got their signs and everything, and they. As soon as my talk is over, all their hands go up, in the audience. And so I think I might as well just take this head on. And so I started calling on each one of them to tell me what they think. And the first person pulls out some 3x5 cards out of his pocket, and not having heard a word that I said, just kind of go through his list of complaints about why the Northern Arizona University would invite a communist on taxpayers' money to come talk to them, to preach at them about why Obama is so great. And I said, well, I'm neither a communist nor do I think Obama is so great, but nevertheless, I said, just tell us why you're here. What do you want? What kind of politics do you represent? And he said, I want to defend the Constitution, and that's why I'm a Tea Partier, because I defend the Constitution. I said, well, that's great. So what about the Constitution do you really think is under threat that needs defending? And he says, well, we need a balanced budget. And I said, okay, I don't think there's anything in the Constitution about a balanced budget, but what about that is concerning to you? And he says, well, we're going to debt because all the immigrants coming in, and they have microwave ovens and flat screen TVs. Microwave ovens and flat screen TVs. These immigrants all have them, and here they are in our country with these appliances and electronic devices, I guess. And so it was over and over. I kept asking questions, and immediately they would begin with a kind of set of political questions about constitutional propriety, and would slide right into either racism or anti-immigrant discourse, or kind of a Western environmental anti-statism. There was a couple that ran a river rafting outfit, and they were no longer able to stop on the banks of a river where they used to, where they would set up and have lunch for their people that would take down river, and they had visible rage towards a spitting rage towards Obama. And I asked them, was there another place where you could put that blanket down and have lunch? Besides the place where they said that you were, this riparian area you weren't allowed to? And they're like, yes, but that's not the point. The point is we should be able to put that blanket down wherever we want along the river and have our lunch. And this dictator is not letting us do that. It was a whole, Obama had come and that loomed over them in ways that they couldn't quite articulate into things that really affected their lives so much, but it was quite palpable. Anyway, so that's just one of a number. I went to a lot of Tea Party rallies in those days.
So, despite all the forays that the Tea Party made, and sort of the full-blown reappearance of this perfect producerism with their parasites from above and parasites from below, all encapsulated by Obama himself, despite all that, in 2012, Obama is reelected. It's a big defeat for the Republicans. And what comes out of that is a report called Growth and Opportunity Project from the Republican Party, basically saying we're not diverse enough, we're on the wane if we don't reform. So the paradox is, how is it that Trumpism is the outcome somehow of that report, the paradoxical outcome of that report, and how come that 4 years after that report, you not only have the victory of Trump, but also the for the first time, a real mainstreaming of the far right and the militia. So how does this paradox pan out?
Well, one of the things that happened in that election, and Obama's second election, was that the Republican Party, partly based on Tea Party energies, had really come out with a very strong nativist, anti-immigrant set of positions that that Mitt Romney, who had not held himself personally prior to that, decided that he really needed to jump on board with, and talked about how people needed to self-deport and that kind of thing. And so one of the things that that happened in that election is that Republicans really lost the Latino vote, and the Latino vote was growing by percentage in the American electorate in ways that had become quite consequential. And Bush had been able to keep the Latino vote, upwards of 30 to 35% in both the 2000 and 2004 races. Republicans lost the Latino vote extraordinarily so in that in Obama's second run. So that's part of the story. They lost in both runs, but really that second one became, because of the numbers, it became really something that was an important thing to look at. And it was such a loss for Romney that this report was made, also, known as the autopsy, where Republicans decided, okay, well, we need to stop looking so racist. We need to stop looking so anti-gay, and we need to speak to women. We're doing terribly in all these areas, and so we need to remake the party in a way that's much more inclusive, is much more of a rainbow, and we need to articulate a conservative set of economic politics that are in concert with a social politics which looks more like America and looks more like what Americans seem to want. So that was the thing. How are you going to sell neoliberal politics in a rainbow way? And that's what the report really laid out. And this was the problematic set down for the entire party. So then in that next election, then you had a number of candidates, capable candidates, come forward on the Republican side who really attempted to do just that. This was the politics you saw with Jeb Bush, with Marco Rubio, go down the whole list. The one thing that report had not focused on at all was class politics and how you're going to keep people who felt like they were falling off the bottom into that party. It was essentially an elite neoliberal corporate diversity campaign model, and it just dissolved immediately in the face of Donald Trump when he announces in June 2015 that he's running for president, that the country's being overrun by immigrants from Mexico who are drug dealers and rapists. And this was an extraordinary gesture coming down the golden escalator in a way that at first everyone denied, but one of the things that a lot had changed in the intervening years. One of them is the result of one of the long results of the 2009 recession, which had many more white people who were no longer, had underwater mortgages, who had stagnant wages now for a couple of decades, and now there was an opioid crisis happening across white America, both rural America and in small cities and towns. This was something where you began to see white poverty happening in a way that had not been the case since the New Deal state. One of the things that New Deal had been was, as Ira Katznelson called it, affirmative action for whites. So going back to the 1930s, white people were kind of brought in and given a series of guarantees through the Social Security Act, through the Federal Housing Authority, through the GI Bill, through one thing after another, which secured an American white middle class and meant that white people were not going to be falling off the bottom in the same way. This hammering away at unions over the years, as well as kind of neoliberal restructuring and the upward transfer of wealth, left white people more and more on the outs. And so by the time you got to 2015 and the emergence of an opioid crisis, you had real social scientists, sociologists beginning to see something. Not just there was great opioid addiction and also greater alcoholism and greater suicide rates in a lower life expectancy among white people, white men in particular. So this was something. This is happening during the time when Trump is running in the 2016 primaries, and so it's kind of a curious thing, because one of the things that happens also at the time is that white conservative writers are beginning to talk about the white poor in a way that they used to only speak about black and brown people. Charles Murray, chief sociologist of the American Academy,
An author of the Bell Curve.
Co-author of the Bell Curve, writes a book called Coming Apart in 2010, where the argument is white people are socially and culturally disorganized. They've lost the work ethic. They're not getting into marital arrangements. They're essentially acting like how he's chronicled and described black people, right? So white people are now acting like black people, and that's why they're losing. He said not only that, it's not just a cultural thing, it's a genetic thing. Whites with low IQs are reproducing with other whites with low IQs and producing kind of a speciation of white poor people who are genetically inferior. So, and he really says in that book, he's like, look, everybody calls me a racist, but I'm not a racist. Now I'm talking about white people in this way. So this was something where you have, and the National Review magazine is referring to Appalachia as a big white ghetto. There's beginning to have this racialized language. And there had been, attacks on public sector unions, kind of white-dominated public sector unions in the wake of the Great Recession, that began to use the language of parasitism and dependency to talk about white workers. These white workers and unions didn't have a good response. They were like, we've never had to defend ourselves against these kinds of charges. Our whiteness has always indemnified us, and now here we are being called welfare queens. So there was a lot that changed on the horizon that Trump was able to tap right into. And if you look at across the primary season, but particularly if you take Super Tuesday, the biggest day of American primaries in the cycle, Trump did best in counties where white people were doing the least well. He brought all these new voters into the system, white people who felt like they knew that Jeb Bush wasn't their friend. They knew that Marco Rubio wasn't their friend. They knew that Ted Cruz wasn't their friend. They knew that none of these neoliberal Republican candidates were on their side about anything. And now they didn't even seem to be particularly jazzed about helping out white people. Trump comes on the other side and says, we're going to bring manufacturing back, we're going to deal with your poverty and your misery, and by the way, we're going to crush Latinos, or we're going to crush immigrants, and we're going to stop this nonsense with black people, right? So suddenly, these poor whites were offered something. They were offered their whiteness back in some possible way.
So now let's jump to post-victory of Trump, in 2016. And there, in your writing, what is really interesting, one of the very interesting things, is that everything that is generally seen as the multiple failures of Trump 1.0, you kind of see as the seeds that will lead to Trump 2.0. So a few examples. The revamping that happens after the Unite the Right debacle in Charlottesville. Second, COVID, which was seen as the peak of mismanagement of the Trump administration, nonetheless fueled a conspiratorial far right that became more prominent. Three, the George Floyd moment, the Black Lives Matter moment, which is also seen as finally something coming from the left, but in fact it was also a way of buoying the far right at the time. And then finally the assault on the Capitol on January 6, 2021 did not kill the Stop the Steal movement, but gave it breathed new life into it. So all these little moments of how the ostensible failures of Trump 1 were in fact the seeds of Trump 2.
Yes, I mean they learned a lot. I mean Trump came in as a far right candidate to become president of in a set of arrangements that allowed him very little latitude to move. And he has many failures across that first year, partly because he's up against a civil service that can't be fired. He's up against norms within federal agencies that are not easily changeable. He is up against a very large and dense federal bureaucracy generally, and in a dense institutional environment in Washington, D.C. that he's unable to really change. And this accounts for a number of failures of promises that he claims he's going to make good on in that time period. So one of the things then going forward, the most important thing was Project 2025, right? So what they learned from that was that you have to figure out a way to hollow out the civil service. You have to find a way to be able to fire large, vast numbers, thousands of people in the federal bureaucracy and replace them with loyalists. You have to find a way to do that. Ancillary things that you also had to find a way. Remember, he came up against the U.S. military too after Mark Milley, refused to carry out his orders around, using U.S. military against Black Lives Matter protesters. You've got to find a way to get rid of military leaders and replace them with your loyalists. So there was a lot of lessons learned there, and a number of people from the first Trump administration went back, but the important thing here is what they were able to do was get buy-in from the main establishment conservative think tank, Heritage Foundation, in order to reimagine what Trump 2 could do. Okay, so there's different players here, right? There are people around Heritage who really want to exercise a neoliberal agenda that they've wanted to do for some time. They really want to just strip the regulatory state down to nothing. They want to be able to have unbridled market rule. They want to, across whether it's environmental regulation, whether it's Wall Street, whatever else. They have the things that they want to see happen. You have, for Trump, this kind of authoritarian nationalism. People around, the racists and authoritarians around him want something different. They're not so concerned with kind of a market libertarianism, but they are concerned with Caesarist power, with executive power that can't be stopped. And so this is Steve Miller and Russ Vought and other people. So those forces come together in Project 2025, and they're able to cobble together not just Heritage, but 22 other conservative organizations, and begin to recruit like thousands of. So I was at the Turning Point USA, the kind of like right-wing student organization, their yearly conference last year in Phoenix. They bring together like 15,000 college students for 5 days of partying and right-wing propaganda and whatever else. There's QAnon shamans swanning around taking selfies with people, all kinds of things going on there. But there was a woman from Heritage there who was passing around iPads to students who were passing by to get them to sign up to be part of Project 2025. And if they would sign a waiver that would say that they would a non-disclosure agreement for anything that they learned while doing training for Project 2025. If they were vetted successfully and were Trump to win, they would get a place to live in D.C., maybe with like 5 roommates in an apartment, and they would get a job in one of the agencies, and any of the agencies, and you would have a place to go almost immediately afterwards. So you can imagine that happening in all these other spaces where you've got thousands of young people being signed up. They're doing the same in law schools with Federal Society people who can generate all the legal briefs necessary to challenge the normal way the executive branch functions. This was an extraordinary thing. At the time, this was like a year before, this was December 2023, and I knew about Project 2025. I didn't know how extensive it was, and I asked her, is this just for the State Department and for Treasury and for Department of Interior? And she said, no, it's for every agency, the entire executive branch. We're going after all of it. And she kind of went down a long list, and it was extraordinary. I was like, oh my God, I was really like, I wrote a piece soon after for the Washington Post, and really at that time people just weren't thinking about it, talking about it. It really didn't seem at that point that Trump could win anyway, and I was not sure that Trump could win anyway, so I was like not losing sleep over it. But it was, but this was really something, and that was a moment of real learning of how you're going to go in, essentially to create your own executive apparatus, a shadow apparatus, and then just impose it right when you get there. And that's exactly what they've done in ways that were supercharged by Elon Musk, adding another element to it now that they're there. But, so many other things about those years, the emergence of a counterinsurgency force in the streets, which does not look like Charlottesville, but does look like Kyle Rittenhouse, and which was forged in opposition to the George Floyd summer, and cities and towns.
Kyle Rittenhouse is a guy who.
Yes, Kyle Rittenhouse is the 17-year-old kid who shot 3 people and killed 2 of them on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, during a Black Lives Matter protest, who later came out and said he was in support of Black Lives Matter. But part of that was that he presented himself as a figure of kind of civic nationalism, not racial nationalism, and so was able to draw on deep, old American, racially inflected terms like defense of property and defense of community. It's kind of like 19th century Tocquevillian kind of ideas, but which in the American context are easily and immediately racializable, which is what he's able to do, along with the the fetishization of Second Amendment kind of rights and culture. So, but Kyle Rittenhouse becomes like the poster boy for that by the end of that summer. But there had been about 800 assaults on Black Lives Matter protesters by far-right armed protesters. I saw a lot of it up close in Oregon, but it happened all over the country, and there were like 8 or 9 vehicular deaths and a number of other things that were all attributable to this growing paramilitary force, which partly was organized by the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the 3% militia, but a lot of it these were just kind of like organic forms that just grew up in that time period, which then by the time you got to January 6th, they had a lot of practice on the streets. There had been also the invasion of buildings in the Idaho state legislature and the Oregon state legislature, like kind of like mini Jan 6th that happened leading up to that moment. It's important, I think, to say about that, though, that it does matter that really most people who were at the Capitol weren't part of an organized militia, but they were infused with that kind of energy, and they could imitate a lot of what they'd already seen on the streets. Most of those people, like 90% of them, weren't Oath Keepers or Proud Boys. They were just kind of people who had been swept up into like a fascist, Trumpist mass, kind of. I interviewed a few of these folks later on afterwards, and it's actually, there's a lot to be said about how the FBI went after these folks afterwards, which I think is worth talking about. But that one of the things I think matters about that is Trump comes back in. The January 6th convicts and defendants were kind of like not beloved by even the far right. There was not a lot of discussion about these people. Really, Trump was their only defender, really. You didn't see...
Carlson, maybe.
Tucker Carlson also. Yes, Tucker Carlson also. But you didn't see... Charlie Kirk wasn't talking about him. Steve Bannon's not talking about him. Like, they're just not getting much play at all. And, partly they seemed like it was going to be a forlorn group. And had Trump not been reelected, that's the last we would have ever heard of these people. But I think partly his pardoning of these Jan 6ers, partly is because he knows, I think he deeply believes in their loyalty and feels beholden to them. But it's also that it's not so much that these 1,500 people are going to come back out in the streets themselves. A lot of their lives were wrecked by this. the FBI would visit their place of work, and suddenly they're fired, and then their family won't get anywhere near them, and they can't pay their mortgage, and they're on the street, and there's, these people's lives are kind of wrecked by having been involved in this. They probably don't have a lot of appetite to jump back in, but what Trump is signaling is that should the need arise for more of you, I'll have your back. And already Enrique Tarrio was, arrested the other day, right? For there's already counter mobilizations happening in front of the White House where there's been protest, or in front of the Treasury Department, other places where there's been protests. So I think that matters. Is that if you went to, I was at the Republican convention in Milwaukee last summer, and unlike 2016, where there were like fascist, far right, anti-immigrant groups of all kinds, like a circus of them everywhere in the streets of Cleveland in 2016 at the RNC. In Milwaukee, they were nowhere to be seen. And it was because they'd all been kind of incorporated into MAGA Republicanism. All the delegates, in 2016, a lot of delegates were people with elephant neckties who were like, I don't know what's going on here. Now every delegate's a MAGA delegate. They had really absorbed all the social forces into the political movement of MAGA. So in a way, it was as if there's a confidence there that they don't need these outside forces. But now that Trump's back in office and there's a possibility of backlash against that, I think we're probably going to see much more of that again in the streets.
Starting with your book, Producers, Parasites, Patriots, which you co-wrote with Daniel Martinez HoSang, you've been exploring this new and rising formation of the multiracial far right.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, this is an increasingly open, diverse far right, and yet at the same time, it's steadfastly latched onto a kind of white supremacist version of America First.
Yeah.
At the time the book was published in 2019, and I don't know the entire reception history of the book, but I imagine that it was either, the argument of the book either seemed odd or far-fetched. But then, of course, in 2020, and especially in 2024, with the elections, it's been proven correct because a rising proportion of people of color, especially men, have been voting for Trump and the Republicans. And so we were wondering what issues, what observations drew you and Dan to write the book in the first place, kind of motivating dynamics you were observing. And then additionally, a more theoretical question about the argument in the book. Because in the book you draw from Stuart Hall and Natalia Molina to argue that race is less something that explains and more something that needs to be explained. Mm-hmm. And in order to develop that, you use the term racial transposition. Mm-hmm. And so could you additionally define this concept, which is a way of exploring the complex relationship between class and race, ultimately leading to a multiracial right-wing formation?
Okay. Let me see if I can just do this in a concise way. I think, part of what I'll start with the second question first, because what led Dan and I to write that book was an observation, during the second Obama administration, that there was, on the one hand, this kind of demonization of the white poor that I talked about by Republicans and conservatives, and in almost racial terms. And the other hand, the incorporation into the top ranks of the Republican Party of people of color, of Black and Latino, in particular, politicians. And at the time, there were people, and it wasn't just that you had kind of like a colorblind, kind of like tokenistic representation. You had people who were there who were substantial figures who not only were Black and Latino, but would narrate their neoliberal politics through Blackness or through Latino identity. So if you take someone like, Herman Cain, who ran in 2012, he's the Black entrepreneur who became rich on the Godfather's pizza chain. He would push notions of Blackness as key to his success connected to capitalism, that it was capitalism that had liberated him, that he had grown up under humble and even humiliated conditions as a black man in the South, black child in the South, and it was the marketplace that freed him. It was like the market was the way out for black people. So there began to be this language where it's not just like the growing racial liberalism that you saw with George W. Bush, but the idea that neoliberalism was necessary for black liberation. Tim Scott is another example from that time period, and he's still around. He was a black South Carolinian who wins a Senate seat that he ran against one of Strom Thurmond's own children, one of Strom Thurmond's white children. He won that partly by a similar set of arguments about the importance of the marketplace and neoliberalism to black freedom. Blackness was put front and center. So Dan and I are like, what's going on here? We have, on the one hand, a new racialization of the white poor, and on the other hand, a new language of class politics around black liberation and brown liberation. I mean, there's more going on here. And so that was kind of the riddle that we start with. Like, what's going on with race and class? So we turn back to Stuart Hall, who reminds us that, that the relationship of race to class is going to reflect historical conditions. And we are in a condition in the early 21st century of a new Gilded Age, where suddenly you have radical wealth concentration at the top. And under these conditions of real wealth disparities, which are kind of going across the board in American society, is that destabilizing the languages, particularly in a post-civil rights era in America. So we're kind of trying to put this stuff together by trying to track both the material shifts in American culture, the institutional kind of decay that's happening in concert with that, the decline of, the long decline of black civil rights, and along with the emergence of these things we're talking about. So that's kind of like where we began. But then, as you know, while we're writing this book, we started writing it during the first Obama administration. And, also Obama himself is kind of, on the one hand, a symbolic figure of liberal civil rights, but economically he is, a fiercely pro-market, figure himself, not in any way separable from the DLC politics of Bill Clinton before him. So that's kind of how we began to go into the empirics of that book. And so then it's kind of like, once you start seeing something, you start begin to see it everywhere. And suddenly, then Trump runs for president while we're writing the book. One of our questions was, and partly we're looking at white poverty in Oregon as well, and state failure in Oregon. One of the questions we thought of was is it possible that white people, once finally abandoned by their party of protection, under conditions of intensified neoliberalism, is it possible they might begin to see their lot with people of color, like with people who are historic victims of this kind of abandonment? We thought, okay, is there a possibility for a new kind of politics here, where state abandonment and capitalist rapaciousness and prison industrial complex, which is like sweeping, there's more. Not only does the United States put more people in prison than any country in the world, we put more white people in prison than any country in the world. White people are also the victims of all this stuff in a way that, again, it's always they go after, using racial language, you get everybody. That's what the ruling class does in the U.S. So we thought, okay, is there some possibility here? And then Trump runs, and the answer is like, I guess not. It's like they appeal to kind of a really robust and angry, revanchist appeal to whiteness, brought people back in this way that made that an impossibility. But as we were doing that, it wasn't just that we saw this stuff happening in the Republican Party. We saw the emergence of all these far-right formations happening everywhere. And suddenly, there's all these people of color in these formations, and so it turns out that it's, the head of Patriot Prayer, which is the most violent Proud Boys associated street group in the country. It's right up in Portland from where we were living. The head of Patriot Pair is a guy named Joey Gibson, who's half Japanese, doesn't identify as white. His number two is a 300-pound Samoan street fighter named Tiny Tawasi. And none of their politics are around whiteness at all. But they're the most violent fascist street group there is in the country. So, we went up and, interviewed Joey and tried to find out, sift through what's going on with his politics. And so we just kind of built out some from there, where we were seeing these shifts on the landscape. And since then, we actually have an edited volume, which is about to go to press now, on the multiracial right, which you know about, where we pull together anthropologists and historians and sociologists and political scientists to talk about where this is emerging in South Asian communities, Vietnamese communities, other Southeast Asian communities, and Native American communities, Black American communities, Black immigrant communities, various Latino communities, and we see it. And there's many different stories about why you see this emergence. Partly it's about evangelical Christianity and the Christian right. Partly it's about patriarchal politics. Partly it's about incel and misogyny politics more bluntly. Part of it's about kind of, again, this neoliberal wishes and dreams. Part of it is about older traditions of Black American conservatism. Partly, in the Vietnamese community, it's about anti-communism or Vietnamese nationalism. Partly among South Asian communities, it's Modi support, which translates into an American authoritarianism. So there's a lot of different stories going on. But part of it is that the Republican Party has opened the door to these an embrace of these groups on the one hand. The Republican Party always does this two-step move where they push white supremacy on the one hand and open the door to groups of color on the other hand, which I think there's another theoretical question in terms of other work I'm doing now more broadly on the political creativity and flexibility of the right in ways that the left does not have. Their ability to do a recombinatory politics and appropriative politics, which we see them snatch from things from the left over and over and repackage and repurpose for right-wing agendas.
So yes, so going further on that same idea, one can say that from the beginning, and you explained that earlier on in this conversation, Trump ran from the beginning on the premise that whiteness was an asset that was being depreciated, and he was there to reappreciate it. Mm-hmm. But with the emergence of a multiracial far right or right, not much difference between the two at this point, yes. It seems like also non-whites are able to purchase shares of whiteness, mm-hmm. in a way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how would be the process through which you buy shares of whiteness? I mean, you mentioned the fact that, if you glorify the market as a redemptive institution, that would be one way. But what would be the conditions under which shares of whiteness can be purchased by non-whites?
Yeah, I think it really, there are many ways, right? And so you can imagine, like under conditions of greater precarity, the desire to anchor and secure yourself in the American regime. And it may not that you really want whiteness as such, but you might want an anchor. You might want something that makes you feel like you have a stake and you're going to be protected. Becomes much more important, I think. So, there's so many different versions of it, but right now, for instance, in this city, Eric Adams, the mayor, former cop, black mayor, who's up on multiple charges of bribery and from foreign governments and for getting rid of evidence. I mean, there's all kinds of things. He's up on all these charges, and he has gone to the Trump administration to protect him and bail him out. And the way he is doing it, by all accounts, is by opening the doors to having ICE agents and the Department of Homeland Security operate in New York City with the support of the city of New York to go after undocumented people. So part of what Adams' gambit is that he can weather this storm because he imagines that enough black New Yorkers are going to be able to be mobilized against undocumented people, right? So here you have Adams hoping to mobilize black people and black political leaders against undocumented people in a way that will make him seem like he's a protector of black people, right? It's not whiteness directly. I'll be a protector of black Americans and Americanness against these outsiders. Well, whether or not that's going to work at all is a different story. But this is one of the many ways that this story kind of works. And I think under Trumpism, it's almost as if to say, if your choice is to be somebody who is going to be humiliated and be an object of cruelty, or if you have the choice to be a humiliator and someone who doles out the cruelty, which one are you going to choose? Which would you rather? Which would you rather? And if that's the choice that people are left with, are you going to be, and that's classic fascist discourse, right? And so you can bring people into this fascist discourse by being like, we will accept you into this coalition, not as a senior partner, but as a junior partner, as long as you're willing to, work with us to demonize these people. So that's part of how it works. But also, going back to Mike Rogan, there are the counter-subversive tradition has always meant that through deeply racialized discourses and deeply racialized forms of hierarchy and domination and violence and brutality and state formation and cultural formation, you end up with something that doesn't have to be racialized on its face to still have a deep racial logic of exclusion, of domination, of violence. And so it's so built into the American liberal model, born from settler colonialism and black slavery, that it's just how we do politics in this country. It's one version of how we do politics in this country, and being on the inside of it or the outside of it is what, it can be determined by the flexing of political power and state power and forms of violence. It's not, I wouldn't see it as whiteness as such. And I think particularly in a country that's less white all the time, you might have a replacement of whiteness with other forms of exclusion and domination through what I would just see it as, I'm starting to use the language just of authoritarian nationalism as opposed to whiteness as such, I think. And because you can see like how that, Steve Bannon yesterday, this thing that you sent me, where Bannon is saying, American Jews are treasonous if they're not in support of Israel, and non-MAGA supporting American Jews are traitors, and and so you can weirdly speak to an Israeli audience using language rife with anti-Semitism to demonize American Jews in support of Israel. So all this stuff is being re-scrambled in ways that require a lot of sorting out, and there's no easy answers, partly because identities and identifications are in motion, right? They're in motion and they're under change. The whiteness itself as a form of inclusion for, first the Irish, and then late 19th century of Eastern and Southern Europeans, and then post-war of American Jews, that model of whiteness may not adhere anymore in the same way. So it may not be inclusion into whiteness as such as the deeper logic of what whiteness always guaranteed, which was domination and submission.
So you seem to say that it's not only whiteness, it's not only race, but it's sort of a combination of race and nationality, or race and citizenship. I mean, way back, Steve Bannon was even talking about citizenship value instead of shareholder value as like the thing that needed to be appreciated. However, there might be some tension between hailing nationality and pushing a form of intelligence-based or IQ-based race. And one element of this tension, we had an example in the very beginning of the new Trump administration in the dispute between the Doge people, so Ramaswamy was still part of it, and Musk on the one hand, and Bannon on the other, where Bannon was accusing Musk and Ramaswamy of being racist because they were insufficiently xenophobic, since the dispute was about this visa for high-skilled migrants that the Doge people were pushing for, and that Bannon was very much pushing against. So how does this tension between race and nationality operate in the Trump administration, and how dangerous it is for the coherence of the whole thing?
So, in some ways, it's mobilizations of different visions of racism in politics, and I think you have to step back and look at what each of them represents, what Musk represents politically and what Bannon represents politically. Bannon has long said that what he wants is a populist nationalism that brings in Black and Latino workers. He's sincere about that. You know, he went around, after he left the Trump administration the first time around, he spoke at Black and Latino chambers of commerce around the country, making this appeal over and over, that we need a populist movement of working class Blacks and Latinos along with working class whites to make an American nationalism. It's a certain kind of like mid-century American pluralism as populism. So, you know, that was Bannon's, let's call that Bannon's American voice. I think he sounds different in Europe, and I think he does different things in Europe. But for him, it's really, he has deeply culturally nationalist impulses and instincts. Musk really represents, you know, this kind of like tech libertarianism, you know, tech capitalism, in a way that's kind of like more of an oligarchic politics. You know, the first thing he does when he gets in there is start asset stripping the federal government. You know, just in this way that's purely about markets and purely about control by certain sectors of the market and purely about moving things in his direction. That's not populist nationalism, and it's not even really fascism as much as it's, you know, it's like we're kind of stuck with a choice here between oligarchy and fascism in the Trump, you know, administration. But I think there's a wedge there to exploit. But I think, you know, so Bannon's version of racism is to attach racial difference and racial parasitism to elite South Asians and to elite non-whites who are taking jobs at the top. And that's what, you know, and that's a populist producerism. That's an idea of like hardworking Americans are being exploited by these people coming in from out of the country to take the best jobs and the best wages at the very top. So for him, there's a deep kind of like almost Jacksonian kind of populism there, which he aims at South Asians at the top. Musk is, you know, his version of racism is, you know, to find the people who are the most talented at the top and the most educated at the top and the people who can do the kind of jobs he wants to get done in a way that will make the most money there at the top. It's almost as if there's some complicated relationship between Musk's white South African heritage, both his father and his grandfather, his own childhood in apartheid South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa, and on the one hand, and this kind of like tech utopianism, neoliberal capitalism on the other hand. But I think the way that it plays out, or it played out in that fight, was really between kind of an authoritarian nationalism that Bannon represents versus kind of like raw neoliberal imperatives on the other hand.
Now to the question of gender, which has been obviously looming in the background, but is quite central here. Maybe to begin, what role does the appreciation or aspirational redemption of masculinity play in this movement of a multicultural or multiracial right that we were talking about before? Also, and here I'm thinking about some of your ethnography of Turning Point USA and other conferences. To what extent can women nonetheless find themselves drawn into this movement in various ways? And then to fast forward to this world we live in after the election, where we've seen increasingly or immediately after Trump took office, a far-reaching attack on DEI, on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's in the government, in universities, and corporations, which are now taking apart these initiatives that have been moving forward over the past decade. So how does this widespread assault on DEI either solidify or compromise the diverse right-wing coalition that we've been talking about?
Okay, I may have to ask you to ask me that second question again after I answer the first one, and they're both really important ones. Gender is fundamental to all of these phenomena, and it's the point that will relate this first question to the second one. But certainly, as a form of fascist affect, masculinity matters enormously. It always has in any fascist formation, partly because it's about dominance and about control and about winners and losers and about who can, who gets to make who suffer and who gets to make who submit. And these are read as masculine in American culture the same way they are in European culture and elsewhere. And so this stuff has been a way, this is the very basis of, say, the Proud Boys, right? The idea of street violence and of a fraternity and a sense of bonding and a sense of meaning and a sense of belonging between and among men has been through misogyny and through violence, right? So there's something cultural in the street value of masculinity in those kinds of formations. You see it culturally in and certainly in the, really across the first Trump administration, the real fascist comportment. The political theorist Bill Connolly wrote a great book, Aspirational Fascism, where he takes up all the cultural aspects of like what the male body and the kind of like the male body, the invulnerable male body, which is closed off and is armored, either on a football team or at a militia rally or whatever else, is a way of it's an approach to the world. It's an approach to other people. It's an approach to your job. It's an approach to sports and life and culture, and it's an approach to power, which is already all over American society. It's just organized and concentrated in these fascist politics. Partly it matters because, in political terms, what it reads out, right? What gets read as the feminine in American political culture, for instance, is nurturance, care, interdependence, mutual aid, right? These are things that are that we read as what happens in the home, what mothers give to babies, as opposed to something that we would imagine happens or should happen collectively. So for right-wing politics, cooperation, mutuality, care, nurturance are things that have to be eradicated, have to be shut down, have to be closed off. And that's culturally enacted through male bodies, through masculine bodies and through masculine forms. And then that also then means that you must defend that position against all potential opponents. And the way even, someone pointed out recently, I forget where I saw it, but that, if you look at what Mark Zuckerberg looks like now, or Bezos looks like now, or they're all like jacked, they're all like on steroids or testosterone or whatever. They didn't used to look like that, or Musk also. There's a way that the kind of like the fascist cultural comportment, the performative aspects of it, tell you so much that you need to know about how this is fascist altogether. And it matters because it's meant to close off any kind of vision of the left that we would want to see. So in terms of the multiracial right, this was a way to draw in some black men, certainly around questions of, I think after the Dobbs decision last year, the question of what women's autonomy would be, and not just what women's autonomy, where women are and should be in the world, came to the fore as an organizing component of what would happen now in the states in the post-Dobbs era. Were states going to fight, for or against the right to abortion? And then the right to abortion then becomes sharpened again as a question of male authority and control of the household, and male authority and control of women's bodies, and the role of what women should be doing in the, where they should be. Should they be in the workplace? Should they be in the public sphere? Should they be in the home? Well, all the anti-abortion stuff moves towards women being in the home as controlled figures. Now, that's different a little bit than this kind of like ultra incel stuff, which is just anti-woman altogether. It's just pure misogyny. But traditional fascism has always had a strong natalist component of women as reproducers of the culture, women as in the home producing the moral subjects that, and meeting their needs for recognition that they can go out into the world as men and act. So that's different than, and that's the more, now you see J.D. Vance kind of, and these other folks, push this. It's also tied closely to, I think some of this is borrowed from Orban and Hungarian politics and East European right-wing politics generally. But there it is articulated and has now since come through Orban into American conservative politics around this idea of parental sovereignty and family sovereignty, around both then what's being learned in schools in terms of critical race theory, but also what's learned in schools in terms of LGBTQ identity or life or anything else, or as they like to demonize it and muster the possibility of people outside of the home who are determining the chemical mutilation of children, as they say it, right? So the idea of parental sovereignty is a deeply gendered thing. It was about male father authority over a woman who's raising children in the household against teachers, against public schools, against teachers' unions, against public goods generally, against the idea of a public generally, right? This is, part of this goes back to, there's a Thatcherite version of it, right? That says there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and families. And the family aspect of this really matters in terms of how this gendered world is enacted as a fascist world, because again, for right-wing politics generally, as for so much of politics, I think, in mainstream politics, the family is the nation writ small, and the family structure of authority is the structure of the nation writ small. So that gender stuff really matters, and it provides. But for the multiracial right, it provides on-roads through anti-abortion politics, through evangelical politics, through patriarchal politics generally. And through kind of like the idea that and the Harris campaign triggered a lot of that stuff as well in its own way, right? Through the intersected relationship of race and gender, and where we saw that. And I don't think it's true that Harris lost because she's a black woman, but those aspects of it were animated throughout because they so easily fit the logic of it. And all the trans stuff, all the anti-trans stuff is really about gender threat, right? And about not having clear boundaries or clear, and that gets into the second question about DEI here. So the DEI stuff both moves backwards and forwards. The CRT stuff kind of fell away a little bit during the early days of the Trump campaign, then came back, or as something that was happening.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory, yes. now it's back fully, and it's back partly because the work that race has always done in American politics is used as a battering ram against every other public good, against any other redistributive impulse, against any other idea of collective freedom or social freedom. If you go in there with race and destroy the idea, say that it's what you're doing is you are protecting white people from black people, then you end up protecting capitalists from social provision, right? So the DEI stuff now can be used, it's like, you know, he spreads it like peanut butter on anything, right? Like to be used against, as an anti-trans politics and an anti-black, anti-brown politics. But it works in a specific way right now in regard to the state because it builds on this long-standing discourse that the federal state, and this goes back to the civil rights movement, this goes back to the 30s, it goes back to the Dixiecrat revolt, that the federal government, it goes back to Reconstruction, really. The federal government represents blackness. The federal government represents non-whiteness. The federal government represents a form of dependence that white people don't benefit from. This was disrupted during the New Deal, but only disrupted during the New Deal insofar as black people can be kept out of federal guarantees, which they were all over the place, right? But by the time the Johnson's Great Society program comes around, after the Civil Rights Act and Great Society and the EEOC, black and brown people there's movements towards creating the possibilities of equity by using the federal state. And this is what, is what brought together white Southerners and Northern conservatives to begin with, the idea that the federal state was making things more equal. And so you had to destroy and demonize the federal state in order to, for conservatives, for Southern racists, you want to get rid of the federal state not because you hate the New Deal in the 1930s, but because you hate black people and you want to make sure that they're not equal. If you're a Northern conservative, you may not be so concerned about black people, but you know that using that language can help you destroy the regulatory state that you don't want in your way, right? So that's how race and the federal state go together. So, 2025, Musk is taking his, the chainsaw that Milei gave him at CPAC the other day and destroying major parts of the federal state. And the only way that you can defend it is by saying, if you just said, we're getting rid of the federal state because it offers people these entitlements, these guarantees, these regulations, these ways of having a functional park system, whatever, that's not going to work. You have to have a monster. You have to have forms of demonization. DEI is the language then to do that. And because you get, so what Musk is doing is he's not just going after, and this is where, many people on the left get this, say Jacobin Magazine gets this terribly wrong, for instance, or Ben Burgess, or these other people who imagine themselves as kind of like left Trumpists, I guess, I don't know. But the idea is that what was been going after was just corporate DEI, corporate PMC, professional managerial class diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and those were just for the capitalist class anyway, so fuck them. But actually what we see is that's not what's going on. They are stripping back every form of anti-discrimination and guarantee of racial equality going back to the '64 Civil Rights Act and before. They're smashing all the way through the EEOC right back there, having already destroyed the Voting Rights Act of '65. So this is what the work of DEI is doing generally. It works for Trump because Trump wants to guarantee white racial nationalism for a certain amount of his base. It works for Doge because it allows them to destroy the regulatory state for the capitalists.
So we've been talking about the making of right-wing hegemony at various points, and now maybe we could look at the flip side of it, specifically the disaffection in this past election of a lot of people from the Democratic base, because we can both tell the story of how the Republicans won the election, but we can also tell a story about how the Democrats lost it. So if you could speak to that briefly, that would be great. But then also a kind of more general question, perhaps. What do centrist liberals not get about the right? Mm-hmm. And related to that, and you just spoke to this a second ago, what does the left not get about the right in your view?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What was the first question again?
The first question was about the disaffection of the Democratic base, which then will lead to the kind of more general question of like, what are liberal centrists not getting about the right such that this disaffection could happen in the first place?
So it's not only what they do wrong, but what you do not see.
Yeah, what they don't see, yeah. I think, it's easy. People love to project onto election results their pet theory of what happened, right? Everybody does it. Liberals do it, leftists do it, everyone has their story. And the problem is there's no way to really do that, accurately, because what you have is an aggregation of hundreds of thousands or millions of individual decisions that get made, right? And they get made in 1,000 different ways, even in the head of any one individual, about why they're going to vote the way they do. Plenty of people weren't paying attention until the last minute. Plenty of people, voted in a way that they probably weren't necessarily deeply connected to or committed to as a politics. Maybe it was, for some people, it was about inflation or egg prices or just kind of a general frustration with the Democrats or a disliking of Biden or a disliking of Harris. For some smaller portion, it was Palestine. I think it's very easy to overstate that. But really, it's like I think the question is not really, in some ways, not a straight-ahead question about how Republicans won or how Democrats lost. But the question it does leave is, what didn't the Democrats do to provide a substantive vision that could compete with the Republican Party? I mean, it's also true that Republicans have a lot of advantages in terms of control of a media space, which seems to have mattered quite a bit. So in Pennsylvania, for instance, Democrats had an extraordinary ground game. This door-knocking campaign, this street by street canvassing, and a very complex operation that involved thousands and thousands of volunteers who were fanning out across that state from Philly to the foothills of the Appalachians, doing this kind of door-to-door work. The Republicans did none of that, and they won Pennsylvania anyway. And Pennsylvania is not a given that it's a Republican state. So partly what that shows is that in that context, the media space really was, is people say you can't win elections on media, but really, you probably partly can, right? Between Fox News all the way rightward into, really richly, algorithmically enhanced, conspiracy theories. There is, that makes it difficult for, for Democrats in that situation. But nevertheless, even so, what Democrats have not offered a substantive response to the crises that we're in. And so this is a problem at different levels, right? So Democrats are forced to, and liberals and even people on the left, we're forced to defend institutions that are no longer viable institutions. The institutions of liberal democracy cannot confront the crises, the multiple crises, or polycrisis, as some people like to say, that we now are faced with. The Congress can't do it. The courts can't do it. The executive branch pings back and forth between 1,000 executive orders this way and then 1,000 executive orders that way. State legislatures can't deal with it. This court system can't deal with it at the state level or the national level. There are the federal bureaucracy can't deal with it. The crises of capital and of ecological collapse and of artificial intelligence and social media and on and on and on and on. These are not things that are in a terribly unequal society that's becoming more unequal all the time. These institutions can't manage it, right? But Democrats are the ones kind of left kind of defending these institutions, while Republicans are the insurgents against them. There is extraordinary political energy and vision on the right at a dense intellectual level as well as at an affective level in terms of offering alternative fantasy worlds of what life could look like that provide meaning, that allow you the incredible pleasurable feelings of anger and grievance. Those are deep psychological pleasures, right? And the idea of what fun it is to be a conqueror, And they have all of American history's worst elements of patriarchy and white supremacy to draw on to make that case. So the left is liberals and the left are in a very difficult position in regard to that, I think. And so there's no easy answer, particularly because we also we have a Democratic Party that is, as I said earlier, not open to its left-wing insurgent base or insurgent elements of a base. That's donor-controlled, that's elitist, which is top-down and unwilling to shift or move. We saw it happen twice with Sanders. It just will not allow insurgent candidacies, will not allow very popular opposition to free market capitalism. So the Democratic Party itself is not an institution that can do this work for us now. So that puts us in a very difficult position vis-a-vis the growth of American fascism. Now that the Republican Party is controlled trunk to tail by fascist elements, from the county level all the way up to the White House. So I don't have good answers to that, but I think that's would be my diagnosis of where we stand at this moment.
Which leads to our last question, which is based on the fact that in late January, so a few weeks ago, there was a big demonstration in Argentina against Javier Milei, the libertarian president of Argentina, and it was a trans-feminist-led demonstration. It was huge, and the slogan was remarkable because the slogan drew on something that both Trump and Milei love to say: there are only two genders. And the slogan of the demonstration was, there are indeed only two genders: fascist and anti-fascist. And so this leads to a double question. The first one, to which you have in part responded, but maybe a little more rumination could come with it. Is it fascism? Mm-hmm. What we're experiencing here, what they experience in Argentina, what is growing very quickly in Europe right now, what we have with Modi, what we have with Erdogan, what we have in Israel, and so forth. Is it fascism? Is that the right word? Because some people, from Biden to others, talk about oligarchy rather than fascism. Mm-hmm. So how these two can be articulated. So that's one question. But another question, which is probably more interesting than the definition of is it fascism, is it not, is regardless of how you answer that question, do you think that anti-fascism is the right perspective and the right approach? Mm-hmm. Not to actually draw a program, but to start the resistance mm-hmm. to what's happening. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, I agree with you that the question of how to define this moment, or whether it's fascist or not, is can be a narrow and limited way of trying to understand the ground that we're on. I do think it's worthwhile to draw on past examples of fascism for what it can teach us and what it can show us and what, where we see resonances. And there are so many. There is part of my hesitance, and I'm sure it's part of your hesitance, is that there can be kind of kind of a liberal hysteria around that term, which is kind of like a kind of a mid-20th century liberal vision of Nazi Germany, right? And which promotes the American regime and liberal democracy as itself something that is worthwhile. One way that I answer that question sometimes is to say that we have to really look at what's old and what's new, and that there are, as I already outlined, there is there are forms of hierarchy and domination rooted in gender and race and class that are just this one logical conclusion of which is Trumpism. There are specific modes of anti-democratic and white supremacist and pro-market politics in the Republican Party, which start with Goldwater in '64 and move forward to this moment. So there's something there as a shorter history, but one that's a very consequential one, which brings us to this moment of fascism. And then there's something about the novelty of this moment where we are now, which is inflected by many things that I just answered in the last question, which we have to kind of sort through. In the American regime, it's a federalist system, and there's a lot that can happen at the local and state level, and there's forms of resistance that can happen there, and it's a big country, and it's not so easy just to have regimented forms of authoritarian rule, and we should remember that there's many different resistance can take many forms. In terms of, I think I less think of like globally that we have some kind of unified march to fascism than a retreat from democracy, right? Which then there's many kinds of authoritarian rule. There's many kinds, whether it's oligarchic or fascist or kind of Caesarist forms of authoritarianism. All that's being expressed on the world stage. But what's, it comes in the decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the decolonial, anti-colonial struggles, and the possibility of like non-aligned internationalism of, that was through Africa and the Caribbean and Latin America and Asia, and through a series of defeats that buoyed any possibilities of democracy have kind of been played out, but it leaves us in a place where democracy has very few resources to draw on in the face of growing authoritarianism. So, in democracies, in substantive democracies' absence, we see the growth of these things in different ways, in different forms. I think across the globe, some of them are, colonialist in nature, like in Israel. Some of them draw on forms of authoritarianism in Soviet Union, which is both Soviet and Tsarist, but in any case, so I say that partly to set up to your second question, like, is anti-fascism the way to, is a proper mode of resistance? And I guess partly it would depend on what, when I think of anti-fascism, when I was younger, I would think of anti-fascism as my vision of it would be the FAI and CNT and Spain, and I would think of Barcelona in 1936, and it's because that form of anti-fascism was anti-authoritarian, and it was anarchist, and it was collectivist, and brought into practice new forms of democratic decision making and new forms of popular sovereignty, which opened up all kinds of other social and cultural possibilities and individual possibilities for liberation along with it. And so there's a part of me that really deeply holds on to that. I think there are elements of spontaneous, anti-colonial resistance and anti-racist resistance versions of in the developed world context. I think of for me, one of the models is the Black liberation and radical feminism here in the late 60s and early 1970s. In the UK, I think of the massive anti-police riots that spread across the UK in 79, 1980, 1981, led by Caribbean and South Asian migrants who then, these movements were joined by white British subjects, and to develop solidarity with people in Northern Ireland, and as partly a multinational movement which had connections in Grenada and in Africa and elsewhere. I think so. The question of what I guess I believe in an anti-fascist politics, a politics of resistance and disruption and deep institutional distrust. But I also believe in it, as part of that is building new collective forms of resistance, and which is also about building new forms of meaning and connection with each other, which I think we need. We have to nurture political cultures which are that people do through music and theater and food and other forms of creativity and mutuality and care. And I'm not sure that's enough, but it may be that what we're headed into is a long crisis, which is an ecological crisis and an economic crisis and a global militarized crisis that perhaps the best we can do is find and build modes of resistance that may take many decades to come to fruition. But I don't think we get there through liberal politics, and I don't think we get there through the Democratic Party, and I don't think we get there through, a collection of sectarian organizations on the left that imagine they speak for the working class. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's...
No, it's a very hopeful note to end the whole.
You always have to end these things on a hopeful note. Like no matter how grim it gets, it's like every article in a socialist magazine always has to end with the possibility of the international proletariat coming in.
You just said we were not there.
Yes,
We clearly are not there. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for such great questions, and it's a privilege to be able to just talk like this too.
Look at all the lovely people.